All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Dyslexia Sparks webinar on myth busting. Today we are going to be discussing some of the myths that are around dyslexia, discuss if they are myths or where maybe some misconceptions of those sorts of things have come from. My name is Samantha Buttle and I am Head of Teaching and Learning at Dyslexia Sparks. So today we are going to look at the different myths that surround dyslexia, but why we need to understand dyslexia a little bit better. I'm sure if you're attending today, you're probably keeping up with the recent news of everything that's going on in the world of dyslexia, which at the moment is quite a lot. And Jamie Oliver's working really closely with the BDA and other organisations with the government to try and improve the provision and the support around those with dyslexia. And that's what this webinar's for. You know, it's to support learners to achieve at school, and we're only going to be able to do that better with a better understanding of what dyslexia is, or potentially what it isn't. We want to make dyslexic learners feel more confident, and as a charity, that's one of our main aims. You know, we want people with dyslexia to feel empowered to use their strengths to support what maybe potentially some of their weaknesses are. And we want to equip dyslexic learners for further education. So it's not just the school years, it's beyond there, whether you go into further education or whether you're in the workplace. You know, we want learners to feel supported and capable in what they are wanting to do. I'm not going to go into this too much because this is not what today is all about. But I wanted to just talk about what dyslexia is. And the origins of the word dyslexia comes in two parts. So the dys means difficulty and the lexis is the language. So the early sort of definition, that understanding of that word, is the difficulty with words and languages. There are more up-to-date definitions than that, and the one that we've been using till very recently is the one that was published in the Rose Report in 2016, which is it's a identifiable development difficulty with language and learning cognition. That was a bit of a mouthful, sorry. But it impacts accurate and fluent word reading and spelling. In the world of dyslexia, this definition has also been updated, which has been released this year, and it's not going to change huge amounts of things in terms of people's understanding of dyslexia. It's more aimed towards those that are diagnosing dyslexia and working with dyslexia in a sort of role like what I do. So dyslexia hasn't changed, but that definition has been reworded and reworked through lots of research that's been going on for the past few years. So, myth number one, I'm going to jump right in. Myth number one, reversals of letters and words are symptoms of dyslexia. So this is something quite common that we hear about, that we talk about, especially around dyslexia. Okay, so before I go into this too much, I would just like to show you a simple representation of what reversals can mean and can look like, especially when we're naming something. So we're going to go back to when we are very young and we are learning new words, naming words, and hopefully you can all see my screen. And on there, I would like you to tell me what this picture is. So hopefully you can all see a book. All right. If I showed you this picture and asked you what it is, hopefully you would still tell me it is a book. Again, we have a simple representation of a book. None of these pictures look the same, but when we name this object, when we name this thing, it is a book. So looking at this book from all different angles, all different ways, it is still a book. So then let's think about how we start to learn letters and those sounds that are attached to them. So what have I got here? Hopefully you can all see that, and I hope you're all shouting B or B from wherever you are. And then we have this one. So it's very similar in shape, it's just flipped round. Okay, but in reading, in our interpretation of this symbol, it actually makes a different sound. And then we bring more complexities into this. So this effectively is the same shape, but flipped over and flipped over on its side and flipped over top and bottom. So letter reversals are really common with lots of young children, especially when they're learning to read and write. This can happen with children that are dyslexic, but it can also happen with children that are not dyslexic. This is because they're learning those processes of what those shapes mean and how we identify them towards a sound. Letter reversals can be a sign that those spellings or those letters or those connections between that letter and that sound have not been firmly established. Okay, so this can happen with dyslexic children and non-dyslexic children. What usually happens is as children get a little bit older, they become more confident that those links have been made and they are more firmly established. We start to see difficulties, we class it as a difficulty with letter reversals when children are starting to get a little bit older and those connections have still not been made. So letter reversals are not necessarily a symptom of dyslexia. We can see it in children with or without dyslexia in those early years. It tends to become more of a concern as children get a little bit older. So if children who are potentially in year 3 or year 4 or above, if they are still making those letter reversals, that sound and that symbol, that grapheme are not established. So we need to start looking at why potentially that is. But it doesn't necessarily mean from a young age that they are dyslexic. Let's have a look at myth number 2. A person with dyslexia will never learn to read. So my role at Dyslexia Sparks, I am head of teaching and learning. I've got a fantastic team of teachers around me. I teach children and adults with dyslexia, and I also assess for dyslexia, but I am also dyslexic. So I can read, but what we are finding, and this is a lot around this campaign that Jamie Oliver's really pushing with the BDA, with the British Dyslexia Association, the earlier that children are identified with these difficulties, the less likely they're going to have problems as they get older, because we are able to put the right support in place earlier. So early identification means that we can put the right early support in place, intervention, and then they are less likely to have those difficulties as they get older. However, those with dyslexia may continue to struggle with their speed of reading. So as an adult, I can read pretty well. My reading speed is okay. It's probably about average for my age. What I tend to find is that I need to read things a couple of times so that I can really understand that text and really get a good understanding of what it is that I've read. So just because you are dyslexic doesn't mean that you will never be able to read. It's all about that early support, that early intervention, and enabling those strategies to build from an early age so that those difficulties don't follow you throughout your schooling and education. Myth number 3. Dyslexia is a sign of low intelligence. I think a lot of this comes from if you have a difficulty with spelling, um, people tend to think that you are not very intelligent. They don't necessarily look at the words you're using, the vocabulary or the context. They are looking at that word that you've maybe spelled a little bit incorrectly. And also with reading as well, sometimes people who need a little bit of time to read things, if they're a little bit slower, it's seen as low intelligence. This is a complete and utter myth. So dyslexia occurs in individuals with high, average and low average intelligence, just like people without dyslexia. So dyslexia is not linked to your intelligence. Okay, so the cognitive processes that we would assess for when doing an assessment for dyslexia are not the same as IQ or cognitive ability testing. They are two completely different things. They may be looked at within a dyslexia assessment, looking at cognitive ability. However, it is not an indication of dyslexia itself. It's those cognitive processes that we would look for difficulties in when diagnosing dyslexia. Myth number 4 is that dyslexia is more common among boys than girls. This is quite a historic myth and has been around for a long time. And when I was young, it was definitely perceived that more boys were dyslexic than girls. I think that has changed, or hopefully that perception has changed, because in reality, what we are finding is that dyslexia affects boys and girls at almost identical rates. So we've come a long way in the last sort of 30 or 40 years of seeing it as a very boy-dominated difficulty to actually identifying it more in girls. The reason this myth, I think, is around and why this perception was always around is that girls tend to often overcome their difficulties in different ways. So this is a massive generalization, and I will accept it is a huge generalization. It's very similar to autism in terms of boys and girls can present in different ways. So what we see is girls tend to just deal with their difficulties differently. They have different strategies and different way of overcoming what they are finding hard. We also see masking, which is a fairly new concept, but we do see children, again, it's more dominant in girls, masking what their difficulties are than in boys. But overall, the rates of dyslexia within boys and girls is almost even. And I think as our understanding of dyslexia continues to develop and better ways of assessing or more assessing, I think we will continue to see those rates and those numbers stay very similar together there. But as I say, I think that's quite a historic a sort of myth that has been brought up. I know when I was brought up, it was definitely more identified or perceived more identifiable within boys. Myth number 5 is that dyslexia is curable. So dyslexia is not curable. It's not a disease or anything like that. It's interesting when we've worked with children in the past and we ask them to talk about dyslexia and what their understanding is, they sometimes talk about it like it's a disease or something you can catch or get from somebody. And it simply isn't. It isn't that. It is a neurological difference, and you are born dyslexic. You don't just become dyslexic. You may show indicators of dyslexia earlier or later than your peers or other people around you. But dyslexia is lifelong. And I think that is why it is really important, the campaign that is going on and the understanding of dyslexia being improved is so important, because if you have a dyslexic child, or you were a dyslexic child or are a dyslexic child, you are going to be a dyslexic adult. And I was not personally diagnosed until I was an adult, so I had a lot of processes and support strategies in place for myself, things that I put in place just for me. I didn't realise why I was doing those at the time, and now after a diagnosis I can sort of reflect on, oh, okay, that's why I do things in that way, that's why I work in a certain way. And we're going back to this effective intervention. So the earlier that we can have effective, supportive intervention, the better it's going to be for those dyslexic, that those children are going to become dyslexic adults, and they will have the strategies and skills that they need to support them, whatever they go on to do, whatever workplace they go into in the future. We talk about accommodations that can be put in place to support daily life of dyslexia. So as I say, I still have lots of things that I put in place. Some of the adjustments that dyslexic children and dyslexic adults need, they need to be taught those, or taught to use those explicitly. Sometimes those skills, and usually if you're dyslexic and that's why you have those difficulties, they are not going to come naturally or easily. So having accommodations or support, the right support in place that you can teach from a young age, will then continue to develop with you as you get older. Very heavily linked to the one that I've just talked about, that so myth number 6 is that if you give them enough time, children will outgrow dyslexia. So there's strong evidence that supports that those with dyslexia will persist in their reading difficulties, and that they, rather than just developing those skills later on, those skills will not always automatically develop. So it's having this specific input, this specific support, and the earlier that can start, the better for that dyslexic individual. At no point is it that you cannot do it. We've already discussed about dyslexic people not being able to read. It's not a fact that you will never be able to do something. It's just that you need the right support. Sometimes you need that extra time. Time is so important to work on these what we refer to things like reading and spelling as basic skills. And they're really not basic for some people. They are difficult to acquire, yet they are so important in everyday life, in every walk of life. Whatever job you do, whatever role you go into, at whatever level, you will need those reading and spelling skills to some degree. So having that support, it enables those skills to develop as our children are getting older. So as I said before, those children with dyslexia continue to experience reading problems into adolescence and adulthood. And then this is where we can see some other difficulties starting to appear. So sometimes we get young people, teenagers in particular, they are very aware of what they are good at and maybe some of those things that they struggle at, especially in a classroom environment when everyone is put there together. If you struggle with reading as a child and a teenager, you are likely to struggle as an adult. It doesn't mean that you cannot acquire those skills being dyslexic, but it does mean that you may still struggle with them. So all these sort of myths that we can grow out of things, we can't do things, it is simply not true. It's having, all this comes back to having the right support, the right understanding. Why do you do certain things? Why do you not do certain things in certain ways? And then adapting that support or that intervention to that particular person. Myth number 7 is an interesting one for me. So dyslexia only affects people who speak English. I'm not sure if this is something that you have come across in the world of dyslexia. So dyslexia actually occurs in all countries in the world with written language, including the alphabet, but also the symbol-based languages. It can be complex to identify dyslexia in students for whom English is a foreign language. So if we was doing an assessment with somebody and English was not their first language, they would need to be exposed to the English language for a number of years before we would consider doing an assessment. We would also, when we do an assessment, we look for a lot of background information. So if it's for a child, we would obviously ask their parents, but if for an adult, we would talk a lot about your history, your childhood, and things like that. Those who have English as an additional language and dyslexia, we would see those dyslexic difficulties also in their first language. So dyslexia is not a language acquisition difficulty. Those are two separate things. So it's thinking about, do those difficulties apply to their first language? Do we see those difficulties just in English? And a lot of doing an assessment is unpicking that background information, particularly with adults. That's why adult assessments tend to take a little bit longer, and there's a lot more preparation before that, because we really start to unpick potentially some of those support strategies people have put in place for themselves, possibly without knowing. They just use what they have, potentially what their strengths are, to help support what their weaknesses are. There are some languages that are more complex than others. So languages like English and German, they have more complexities to them than languages such as Spanish or Italian. So for example, in English, I think off the top of my head, there's 5 or 6 ways of spelling the A sound in English. So we have A on its own, we have AI like in rain, we have AY like in tray, we have A consonant E like in cake. So when you're learning a new language, and this is why young children with dyslexia find it difficult, because it's not, that sound is not written in just one way. We've got lots of different ways of making that very same sound. And it's being able to associate those things together. This is called your phonological awareness, and this is one of the key indicators of dyslexia. So dyslexia does exist across the world and across all different languages. It is more, I don't want to say easy, it's more notable in some languages, those complex languages, than some of those other languages that are, no language is simple, but in terms of a comparison as to how those two languages work. So it is a myth. It is definitely a myth that dyslexia only happens in English. Myth number 8 is dyslexia is caused by problems in visual perception. Okay, so as I said to you right at the beginning, there's lots and lots of research that's been, dyslexia has been around for a long time. You know, it's had lots of different names, it's been identified in lots of different ways, but there's lots of research and more recent research that's gone into what dyslexia is and that definition of dyslexia. So it is based around a difficulty with processing sounds of language, so that phonological awareness, and it's not a problem with vision. If you go for a dyslexia assessment as a child or an adult, they will ask about your vision and your history of vision. They may ask you to go for an up-to-date eye test before you go for that assessment. That is to rule other things out. So a problem with your vision is not the same. It's not the same thing. So it's not caused by visual perception. Most dyslexic individuals will also have difficulties with speed of processing, which can be visual and auditory. So it's how fast you can process that information, which is given to you in a visual manner or an auditory manner, but it's not your visual perception of that information. And again, speed of processing is one of those key areas that we would look for in an assessment. So there's 4 areas that we would look for. Phonological awareness that I mentioned on the previous slide is one of them, and speed of information processing is the next one. But dyslexia is not a difficulty with visual perception. Myth number 9. Because people with dyslexia think differently, their difficulties in reading leads to gifts in other areas. I think lots of people cling on to these ideas that dyslexia is a superpower. It can make you great at something and other things. And I'm not disputing that there are some incredible dyslexic people out there who are absolutely gifted in different areas usually that they're interested in, but it's likely that they are not caused by dyslexia. Otherwise, everyone with dyslexia would have a gift in these areas. So not all people with dyslexia show signs of giftedness, just like those without dyslexia. Of course, those without dyslexia, there's lots of gifted people in the world, and those with dyslexia is the same. So there are some people who are very gifted, but it is not necessarily linked or joined to their dyslexia. What we often see this link from is that because people overcome their difficulties in different ways, they find creative or inventive ways of overcoming their difficulties. But unfortunately, not all those with dyslexia will show a sign of being gifted in another area. Myth number 10, and this is probably, along with letter reversals, probably one of the most common myths that we see at our charity, but within the dyslexic world, I think, from others that I've spoken to that work in this field. So individuals with dyslexia will benefit from coloured texts, overlays, or lenses. So this is a myth. So because dyslexia is not a problem with visual perception, there's very limited evidence to support that coloured overlays or coloured lenses or coloured paper, there's all sorts available, can have any effect on the word reading or comprehension of those with dyslexia. So I know lots of schools do overlay screening and things like that. That is not a direct link to being dyslexic. Needing or having a coloured overlay is linked to something called visual stress. So the misconception with visual stress comes from there's a high proportion of people with dyslexia who also have visual stress. However, you can have visual stress and not be dyslexic. Visual stress can present differently for everybody. So, for example, I'll give you some examples of what visual stress is. So, visual stress could be that people see words moving on a page. So, if you're working with your child or a child in your class or somebody you know and they say, oh, the words are moving around their page, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are dyslexic. It's more likely that they will have visual stress. Other people with visual stress don't see words moving. They may miss words often, frequently when they're reading. They may struggle to keep their place when reading, so they might skip lines, skip words. They might just lose their place halfway through a sentence. That's quite common as well. Also, with visual stress, some people see the patterns within words. So where the spaces are within the words, within the text, those spaces become more dominant than the words themselves. So the words fade out and those spaces come to the forefront. Other people with visual stress see haloing around words, so they struggle then with fluency because they struggle to read on from where they are actually, the word they're actually looking at. So they may just be able to only focus on one word at a time. Those people with visual stress, those coloured overlays, those coloured lenses, coloured paper can make a huge difference. It can. For some people, the difference is very minuscule, but using coloured lenses and coloured overlays will not support a dyslexic learner. They still need that supported, structured intervention, early identification to enable their skills to develop. So I think personally this is a really big one, and which is why I've saved it for last, because I know this is a common misconception. When lots of families, when they come for an assessment, the first thing they will say is, do they need coloured paper or coloured glasses? There is absolutely a correlation there between dyslexia and visual stress. However, using those things that support visual stress will not improve word reading or comprehension. It can improve other things because they're able to see the words more accurately and better. So I think if anyone takes anything away from today, myth number 10 about having coloured paper, coloured overlays, is a really important one that I would really like people to take away with them from today. I just wanted to pop this in here because often when we talk about dyslexia and when we talk about what causes dyslexia. There's difficulties with dyslexia. There's dyslexic tendencies. There's skills that we find more difficult. I think it always sounds really negative. And that is not my perception of dyslexia at all. I put this slide on here. So it was a couple of years ago now that LinkedIn made dyslexic thinking an area on LinkedIn. Richard Branson really pushed for it to have dyslexic thinking on LinkedIn profiles, and it was a way of celebrating dyslexia and the positives that come from that. So I've spoken a lot today about some of those difficulties, those weaknesses, those areas that are a little bit harder for dyslexic learners. And we've also sort of talked about it's not always going to be a superpower for some people. It isn't. But dyslexic thinking is a real thing. That sort of problem solving. We talk a lot about considering a bigger picture and being able to see lots of elements and things, and how those things can be put together. I wear this skill on my LinkedIn profile with pride. Dyslexic thinking is definitely a positive of mine, and I do think it helps me in my day-to-day work and the things that I want to achieve. So I also want to finish that, yes, there are things dyslexic people find more difficult. It's not that they're never going to be able to do those things. We need to put the right support in. The only way we can put the right support in for people is to have the right identification and early identification, so that these longer term difficulties then don't start coming through to as they grow into adults. Okay, so thank you all for listening. Today we've talked about 10 common myths that are often asked about or brought up to people when talking about dyslexia. Hopefully that has given you some things to think about, but also hopefully that's helped you with deciding whether something is true or not so true. I really appreciate your time and for listening today. I am going to stop the recording now, because this is the part that will be sent out to all our all those that signed up, but I am going to be here afterwards for some questions if you have any. So thank you for listening, and I'm just going to stop this recording.